These are the principles of the just third way. We discussed basic definitions, and this is to give it a little bit of a more theoretically structured understanding. So we take as really a very comprehensive strategy or strategic objective, what Buckminster Fuller put forth. He was a global thinker, a systems designer, and so he was always thinking in terms of not nation states or one individual, one group against another, but really looking at how to make life on this planet good for every person and also the rest of nature as well. And how to do that, he was addressing it through largely technological approaches, but it was very consistent with our philosophy that in your solutions, you don't want to be causing harm to either the planet, the environment, or certainly anyone else. So, as I said, we want to think of the just third way as a system, meaning at its most basic level, an idea of structure and inputs and outputs and feedback and correction. So that we have at least some working definitions of what a system is. As we have here, we're talking about separate things being able to work together in a coherent way, in an interconnected way. And we also look at system in terms of ideas as a set of principles or uh, in this case, it could be procedures or approaches um, which enables something to be accomplished, but it's organized. It has coherent principles which guide the actions you take, and a set of rules. So we can look at system in terms of laws. Those are a set of rules which are in the just third way. Law is intended to create an environment where people can develop their human potential, uh, can act in a free and independent way, but always within the context of society, other people. That it's always rights are always in terms of other human beings and other things. If any of us were out on a desert island, the idea of rights is kind of moot. So system, we also talk about the prevailing political or social order, meaning what exists today. And people, when they feel that something unjust or there's injustice, they will generally say it's the system, or they may or may not, but their concept of the system is generally kind of big and vague. And what we want to do is start to identify parts of the system which are causing us problems and which we need to fix. So the just third way, that terminology developed over years, and the first time I had heard of it was when I was learning about Louis Kelso, and we had some officials from the Soviet embassy were visiting over at the house, and they were part of an institute which studied the US and Canada, and some of their scholars had come across Kelso's ideas and were fascinated by it, and they called Kelso's ideas the third alternative. This was a little bit after the time where Kelso was being blasted in Izvestia, and there was the other Soviet era newspaper as being the ravings of a madman, but these people took it seriously. So in terms of why they saw it as a third alternative, we can look at it in terms of the prevailing philosophy in the United States. The dominant one, you might say, is one of individualism. That's not completely true by any means, but I think people identify with the idea of the individual is supreme, and this is where rights start. And there's less of this awareness of institutions and things like systems and institutional barriers. So the individual is, in a sense, it's a more atomistic view of reality or society. And we see the counterpart to that is capitalism. So it's you go out there, you work hard, you earn a means to enrich yourself, and you accumulate capital in order to do that. Then you have collectivism, where the individual is subsumed by this larger abstraction of society or the collective, and it's in the values of cooperation, for example, tend to be held in higher emphasis than individual rights. So we see in terms of an economic system that's reflected both in socialism and communism, although some people would see these as two different systems. Kelso would say one is the express train and one is the one that the commuter train, that they get to the same destination. Personalism, and this is something we discussed in the first two sessions, is a philosophy that starts with each individual human being as a unique being with inalienable rights, but this is understood as also human beings as social and political creatures who depend on each other, not only for their survival, but for their full human development. And so we think in terms of each of us, our rights, but also the rights of every other human being, and then our institutions, how we build them together with others to help us develop our human potential. So economic personalism is about the closest ism we've been able to come up with to describe the just third way in terms of economics. So again, I'll try and go through this quickly. Number one is the human person. Everything within the just third way starts from that beginning. That is the moral basis and the dignity and empowerment of each human being. And when we talk about power, we have to get very specific. It's not a rhetorical term. It's really each person having the means of self-determination and independence, being able to protect your rights, and be able to participate fully in society and what we would call the common good. So this was taking from several definitions we found, but it's personalism is a school of thought which focuses on the reality of each person's unique dignity and promotes the fundamental human rights of each person. So that's sort of a generalized way of looking at personalism. Mike has gone into the history of this. We're probably most closely aligned with personalism as John Paul II talked about it, and also Martin Luther King as well. They were very similar in their thinking. Economic personalism, you see the same concept, but now we're looking in terms of economics, our most basic human needs of food, shelter, transportation, whatever that we need, and we engage in the marketplace in order to get those things that we want and need that someone else has, and in this we engage in exchanges. So this is also based on the dignity and empowerment of each person. And when we say power and rights, we're talking about equal access to all of the social institutions and all the traditions and ways of doing things that people need in order to flourish in that society as a human being, as an individual, but also as a member of society. And we're also looking at a system that structurally diffuses economic power. And as Kelso brought to the thinking in economics and beyond that, we have to look at how you can gain true economic power, because most people don't have economic power today. They may think they have political power because everyone has a vote, but you can see how that the exercise of that is, it becomes almost impossible, except if you join together with others to make your vote really count. And so if you are constrained by economic need, we would postulate that you're not truly free, and someone else may be controlling you and therefore able to control your vote. So we have to make sure in all of our structures, whether it's the corporation, the labor union, any kind of laws, monetary policy, that we look very carefully at how it's put together and to see whether each person does have equal access, whether it's concentrating power in any way, and then we have to see how best to deconcentrate and get power back into the hands of each member of that society. So again, in a just social order, this is as under the just third way, all sovereignty begins with each human person. And sovereignty, just for a definition, it's where the supreme power or the ultimate power resides. It also means freedom from external control, autonomy, and it also means having some measure of influence within society or social setting, and also to be free from the coercion of others. So as Mike had pointed out last week, we understand human beings to be natural persons that have inherent or natural rights, meaning no person, no government, no king or whatever can take away your inherent rights. They're part of you by nature. And key to how we are able to exist in a free and independent way, we each need life, we need liberty, and we need to have private property. So we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as rights, but we have to look at, well, what would enable us to be able to pursue happiness? And we have to have not only political power, but even more essentially, we need to have economic power, and that comes through private property rights. And we see that there's a natural connection between power and property, and if you don't have property, well, that tells you you're not going to really have power. You're not going to have economic power. And in Faree's writing, if you look at it carefully, he talks about the supports of human life and human dignity, and private property is one of those supports. And if you take away a support, that is the equivalent to stealing. That's depriving someone of their rights if you take away their support. So Kelso came up with this idea, and this was prior to his collaboration with Mortimer Adler, but understanding the processes of production, or what goes into producing goods and services. And so this seems kind of simplistic that Kelso would say there are two, because Marx, for example, would say there's basically one. It's everything derives from labor in one way or another. It gives value to what ends up being produced. Or you have people who say, well, there's three or four. We have to count, land as a separate factor, or entrepreneurship as a fourth factor. So Kelso would say, let's apply the principle of Occam's razor, bring it down to the simplest components, and he would distinguish between human and non-human, or people and things. And so it's in the mixture of those together that result in the production of goods and services. If you were talking pure labor, then you're talking about someone just using their hands and their body in order to either produce something or gather something that would be exchanged in the marketplace, but that's with no hand tools, no nothing. And then you have tools which can be as basic as a shovel or a pick, and those certainly enhance the ability of a human being to do more. But when you start talking about capital tools, and Faree talks about this, he has something called the development curve, which shows how the population and generally most inventions and progress stayed fairly constant until you hit that point where these capital tools, capital which could produce much more rapidly without all the necessary human interaction with it. So you had, when steam power came in, for example, and you moved away even for the need for using animals, but really getting into the industrial age, now you are in a different game. And he recognized this, but he would lump everything, all forms of labor, whether it's entrepreneurship, manual labor, a brilliant discovery or concept, that's part of, it's attached to human beings. Now, the non-human, he would say, we're going to look at this in terms of what you can own. And that would be all these new man-made artifacts. It would be things that go into production. So it may be land or natural resources. It can also be things that are institutions, like owning shares in a corporation. It's not tangible per se, but it's that tool, the corporation, assists us in producing more and being able to market to more people and distribute more efficiently. So you can own anything that is contributing to production, the non-human, you would call capital. Okay, and he recognized this, as Marx did also, that as your technology advances, there's less labor gets displaced. Now, how Marx analyzed this in terms of stolen labor value that's very different from Kelso's analysis, but they could all see the impact of capital tools on the working person in terms of their ability to generate an income. And this also, in terms of systems, so going from one aspect of the just third way to this idea of, let's look at the economy now, and what does a healthy, sustainable economy look like? And we can see that what was recognized as Say's law of markets, which I think it's colloquially, we think of it as supply will create its own demand and demand will create its own supply, which didn't make a whole lot of sense to me until, I began to understand supply is production and production is income. If you create something you didn't have before, that is something that you need to economically, that's income. And so when we produce, we're automatically creating an income. Now, the problem is now again, we're looking at Kelso's idea of labor and capital producing. If some of us, or most of us, produce through our labor, and a few of us produce with their capital, and the capital becomes more necessary in production, then you start to see how incomes flow to those who produce with the most efficient means, which is capital. So here we see market-based equilibrium, meaning when you have supply and demand in balance, which it's not now. You have what seems to be overproduction or underconsumption. This can be taken care of if you have the ways people produce being more distributed evenly throughout society. And we can do this without compromising private property. So we have the idea of aggregate supply and aggregate demand become equalized if we can connect people both to incomes from their labor and incomes from their capital. And whichever is predominant in the process of production, we have to make sure that every person has access to ownership of that. And we also see, which we'll talk later on, it shows up in how we finance the creation of new and more advanced forms of capital. Who's going to own the robots? Who will own the artificial intelligence? So what we're looking at then is, if this is the condition we're in, that there's high concentration of this very powerful productive factor, capital, how do we move the system into more equitably distributed, or equally the potential for equal distribution or equal access to ownership of these new modes of production? And that is, if you want to do it without redistribution, you're going to have to get beyond how you use the already accumulated savings of the past and look towards a future way, which is through insured capital credit and structuring within the financial system ways for people to have equal access to that capital credit. And here we have another way of saying this is to balance these, a democratization of access to insured capital credit being repaid through the future profits of the capital that you've just acquired. And we call future savings is future profits, meaning when the profits are finally created, you first use them to repay a loan before it becomes consumption income. And so Kelso, how his system restores Say's law is through that universal and equal access to capital ownership, and that's through capital credit and using future savings to finance new capital, not past savings, which will always keep that under the control of those who have the past savings. And then we need a money system, as Mike Rainey pointed out in last week's class. We need a money system that operates on the basis of the banking principle versus the currency principle. And that simply means that the banking principle views and that you're really talking about production preceding money, that you don't bring about production because you pump in money, you match money to production. That's the basis of how much money needs to be in the system. And you're looking at not only existing production, but really more importantly, future production. And so we're looking at how when money is created, it's really looking towards future production as the basis of new money being put into the system, and money which is canceled out once the money is used for its particular purpose of bringing new capital into existence. So then the three principles, so we've got one, the human person or dignity and empowerment of the person, the two factors of production, the three principles of economic justice. And we see here participative justice, the input principle within a system, distributive justice, what you get in terms of your outtake, your reward, and then social justice is just there to make sure that these are in balance. And if they're not, that you have a way of detecting that something is out of balance. And usually what will start happening is you're going to see poverty and other sorts of related problems starting to crop up, or you're going to see the overuse of government redistribution versus people being able to generate their own income. So you're going to see governments start to grow, or you're going to see various disruptions, and that tells you something is wrong in the system. Now, how do we fix that? And so that is what the active social justice is all about, is identifying, understanding the problem, understanding what your institution is supposed to do, and then having common principles, and in this case, we would say the just third way principles for developing win-win solutions. So never at the expense of other individuals or other groups. And Faree says social justice there is no connection to conflict whatsoever. It resolves conflict. So if you have a solution that still has conflict built into it, keep working at it. That's not social justice. Then we have so that we create just laws that create equal opportunity for every person and access to the means to become independent and self-determining. We have to look at what are the policy principles that would encourage a just third way economy. And so the first we start with, this is really the missing element, expanded capital ownership. And then we look at the limited economic power of the state, and sometimes we present these in different orders, but the idea is really in order to have every person being able to participate fully in the economy, a market economy, they have to have the means of being independent and not being coerced, having access to information and having power to choose or to do something or not to do something. And if the government is dictating that is going to necessarily infringe on the economic freedom of individual citizens. So we want to limit economic power of government. Private property is the institutional mechanism by which people are able to have their rights, their economic rights realized, that they can participate, they have equal opportunity to participate, and they also will receive just distributions based on those contributions. And then finally, we say you're really going to need free and open markets, which we don't have today. And it's one of those conundrums or chicken or the egg kind of situations where in order to have free and open markets, we're really going to have universal access to capital ownership, effective access. And free and open markets will then enable you to determine, well, what is the just price? What is the just profit? What is the just wage? Because people will have the means to choose. And one thing about being an owner is if you're trying to find a job and you're desperate, you are going to have less choice than if you have the means to say, no, I'm going to look for a better offer. So if you really want to know the value of human labor, we need to have universal access to capital ownership. And here, this was enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which said that everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others, and that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. And we also, just to round this out, we're looking at what are 5 artifacts of civilization or constructs, social constructs that can bring about change in a system very rapidly. And those things, we would start education, which is what we're doing right now, is transferring ideas so that people can start to see better ways of solving problems and understand what is justice. Because without justice, you will not have peace and you will not have freedom. So we look at education as critical, and education not just to get a job, but really educate people to become critical thinkers, being able to be moral thinkers, being able to be creative thinkers, and be able to thrive within an economy where you have robots and artificial intelligence that can do economic work much more efficiently than human beings. What do we do about that? What kind of lives would we live if we didn't have to worry about money and economic survival? So the second is politics and government, because we have to get these ideas into law. And so that's what the Economic Democracy Act is, a way of getting just third way principles into a body of law that opens up equal access to every citizen to the means to become a capital owner. And it does various other things as well, but it is enshrined in a law. And then really, we have to be looking at money and credit, because if we ignore this, then all the other things are influenced by money and credit. And whether you have a just and orderly and feasible system of what you're creating money for, how we have access to it, who's able to get it and who isn't. So looking at that, that's very key, that we understand that money and credit are going to be crucial to this. The tax system is also important, because that's what feeds government. And government, we believe, has legitimate roles to play and has specific services that it and it alone can provide. But in terms of economics and economic production, that is not the realm of government. It doesn't do it well. And it's better to have choice and competition in the marketplace. But we do need government, and the tax system can also encourage or discourage this idea of equal access to ownership. Then technology, that creates tremendous changes very quickly, such as how the computer, for example, made it possible for people to write books and do computations and also create all sorts of new things based on what the computer could do. And now we have artificial intelligence and we have robotics. So that moves us from a fairly stable situation where when you don't have these things to now it's tremendous tools of power. How do we use them? How do we use them in a beneficial way for everyone? So, but technology, all these things, it can be good and it can be damaging. So how we use these things is critical. But all 5, we would call the 5 major levers of change. And what the just third way, if you were asked to, well, sum it up in one sentence. And we believe that the most succinct way of expressing the just third way is own or be owned. Thank you very much.